A news conference is being held as Britain publishes a parliamentary report on Russian meddling that was finished in March 2019.
This is not true. It had already been through the processes. The final point was said that the proper processes hadn't been followed in the consideration of this report. Can I also say that categorically is not true? Everyone who needed to see the report in government had done so. It was now waiting for the Prime Minister to agree the report, which was sent to him on the 17th of October. The Prime Minister finally provided confirmation the day after the election, having taken a record time in doing so. However, the report can only be laid by the committee, so we had to wait 7 months for the committee to be constituted, again a record period of time. The committee met last week to agree unanimously the report would be published before the House rose for the summer recess, and I'm pleased the report has therefore finally been published today, 9 months after it was completed. There has been some attempt to discredit the report by suggesting that the 9-month delay means that the report is now stale and out of date. You'll see very clearly yourselves today this is not the case. The delay by the Prime Minister inevitably fueled a great deal of speculation as to why and what the report might say, in particular around the EU referendum. That is why Stuart and I thought it was important to talk about the report, to tell you the key findings and to address the speculation that has taken place over the last 9 months. Can I now hand over to Stuart?
Thank you, Kevin. Let me start by saying that the UK is one of Russia's top Western intelligence targets. We know that Russia targets the UK, and not just to steal secrets or research. It suits Russia if there is disunity in the West. It weaponises information. Russia's intelligence services are disproportionately large and powerful, and they can act with little constraint. And the fusion between state, business and serious and organised crime in Russia gives them further weight and leverage. Russia poses an all-encompassing security threat, which is fuelled by paranoia about the West and a desire to be seen as a resurgent great power. It carries out malicious cyber activity in order to assert itself aggressively, for example by attempting to interfere in other countries' elections and by pre-positioning itself on other countries' critical national infrastructure, and this is an immediate threat to national security. Which is why we were concerned during our inquiry to find out there is no clear coordination of the numerous organisations across the UK intelligence community who are working on this issue, and that there is a bizarrely complicated wiring diagram of responsibilities amongst ministers for no good reason. We need a simpler chain of command. We've seen that the government is now taking an assertive approach when it comes to identifying and laying blame on the perpetrators of cyber attacks, and we do welcome this. And the UK should encourage other countries to adopt a similar approach to naming and shaming. We should also be working with our allies to develop an international doctrine on the use of offensive cyber. Kevin.
Russia promotes disinformation and attempts to influence overseas, whether that's through social media, hack and leak, or using its state-owned traditional media, has been widely reported. The UK is clearly a target and must equip itself to counter such effort. Our paper-based voting and counting system makes actual interference with the mechanism difficult. The focus instead is on attempts to influence voters before they cast their votes by spreading disinformation and creating discord by amplifying existing differences. So the question is who is protecting the British public from interference in our democratic process? Well, in a nutshell, we found no one is. We found the defence of the UK's democratic process is a hot potato. No one was prepared to accept their overall lead. Now we now do understand that there is a considerable nervousness about the security intelligence agencies getting involved in the mechanics of a democratic process, and that's rightly so. But we're also talking about here about the protection of the process. DCMS and the Electoral Commission simply do not have the weight and access required to tackle a major hostile state threat. Democracy is integral to our country's success and well-being. Protecting it must be a ministerial priority, with the Office of Security and Counter-Terrorism taking the policy lead and the operational role sitting with MI5. This needs to be gripped now. The government must also ensure that social media companies who have failed to play their part to take down the use of their platforms by hostile states. We need clear deadlines within which material will be removed, and government need to name and shame those who fail to do so. Can I now hand over back to Stuart?
This lack of interest in responsibility is important because it translates directly across in terms of investigation into and action against interference. And we saw that when we looked into allegations that Russia sought to influence voters in the 2016 referendum on the UK's membership of the European Union. Studies have pointed to the preponderance of pro-Brexit or anti-EU stories on RT and Sputnik and the use of bots and trolls. The actual impact of such attempts on the result itself, by which I mean did the disinformation actually change how people voted, would be difficult, if not impossible, to prove. There has, however, been speculation that this report was going to reveal either that Russia had interfered in or sought to influence the referendum. In the committee's view, it's worse than that. The report reveals that no one in government knew if Russia interfered in or sought to influence the referendum because they did not want to know. The UK government have actively avoided looking for evidence that Russia interfered. We were told that they hadn't seen any evidence, but that is meaningless if they hadn't looked for it. The committee found it astonishing that no one in government had sought beforehand to protect the referendum from such attempts or investigated afterwards what attempts to influence it there may have been. The government, the UK government, should have recognised the threat back in 2014 in relation to the Scottish referendum, but it didn't. It didn't understand the threat until after the hack and leak operation against the Democratic National Committee in the United States. And because it was too slow to recognise the threat, it didn't take action to protect the UK in 2016. One would have thought that once the existence of that threat had been understood, seeing what had happened in the US, that someone here would have wanted to understand the extent and nature of the threat to the UK, and we wanted to see the post-referendum assessment. But there isn't one. There has been no assessment of Russian interference in the EU referendum, and this goes back to nobody wanting to touch this issue with a 10-foot pole. This is in stark contrast to the US response to reports of interference in the 2016 presidential elections. No matter how politically awkward or potentially embarrassing, there should have been an assessment of Russian interference in the EU referendum, and there must now be one. And the public must be told the results of that assessment. We heard last week the government disclosed details of attempts to influence the 2019 election, and there was considerable suspicion about the timing of that announcement and whether it was designed to draw the sting from this report. I cannot see anything that would draw the sting from this report. I will say that it's good that work now appears to be being done to investigate attempts to interfere in the UK's democratic process, although the new committee, will reserve judgment as it has yet to receive the underlying intelligence. But it is all rather too late. They should have done this in respect of previous democratic processes. And we must not let what has happened recently deflect attention from the retrospective work which does need to be done to investigate previous attempts. Now, coming back to Kevin Jones' comments about the delay in publication and speculation as to why that was, the previous chair said he thought that the British public should have been able to see the report before the election. And I agree. The public was allowed to go into that election without knowing that the government had not sought to investigate whether hostile states had been interfering in UK democratic processes. And I find that shocking. Kevin.
You, Stuart. The outrage isn't that there was interference. The outrage is that no one has wanted to know if there was interference. And that, I think, comes through very loud and clear in our report. What we do know about Russian influence in the UK is that it's the new normal. Successive governments have welcomed Russian oligarchs and their money with open arms. And there is a lot of Russians with very close links to Putin who are now very well integrated into both UK business, political and social scene in what has been referred to as Londongrad. Yet few, if any, questions have been asked regarding the provenance of considerable wealth. This open door approach has provided an ideal mechanism by which illicit finance could be recycled through the London laundromat. And it is not just the oligarchs either. The arrival of Russian money has resulted in a growth industry of enablers. Lawyers, accountants, estate agents have all played a role, wittingly or unwittingly, and formed a buffer of Westerners who are de facto agents of the Russian state. There is an obvious inherent tension between the government's prosperity agenda and the need to protect national security. To a certain extent, this cannot be untangled. The priority now must be to mitigate the risk and ensure that where hostile activity is uncovered, that proper tools exist to tackle it at its source and to challenge it. Stuart.
It is notable, for example, that a number of members of the House of Lords have business interests linked to Russia or work directly for major Russian companies linked to the Russian state. These relationships should be carefully scrutinised, given the potential for the Russian state to exploit them. There must be complete transparency about any links with Russian businesses at every level of politics. And we do not have that in respect of the House of Lords at present. Now, that is all I'm going to say about what's in the published report. There is, of course, a classified annex, but we cannot reveal details in that report without revealing information which could be harmful to the UK. On the other side of the coin, in addition to Putin-linked elites, the UK is also home to a number of Putin's critics who have sought sanctuary here, fearing politically motivated charges and harassment. Now, the events of the 4th of March 2018 showed the vulnerability of former Russian intelligence officers who have settled in the UK, and this is one of the issues we do address in the classified annex to the report. What we can say is that it's been clear for some time that Russia under Putin is an established threat, fundamentally unwilling to adhere to international law. The murder of Alexander Litvinenko in 2006 and annexation of Crimea in 2014 are stark indicators of this. But in our opinion, the UK government took its eye off the ball because of its focus on counter-terrorism. The government had badly underestimated the response required to the Russian threat and is still playing catch-up. Russia poses a tough intelligence challenge, and the agencies here must have the tools they need to tackle it. The Official Secrets Act, for example, is simply not fit for purpose when it comes to tackling foreign spies. And until we change that, the intelligence community's hands are tied. Kevin.
And just one final point, and that is the need for international consensus against Russian action. To constrain their nefarious activities will rely on making the price to Russia that they extract sufficiently high that they will change, hopefully, their actions. The West is strong when it acts collectively together, and the UK needs to take a leading role in that. The expulsion of 153 diplomats from 29 countries and NATO following the US chemical weapons on attack in Salisbury was unprecedented.
All right, that was a briefing by UK spy chiefs who have accused Russia of meddling in UK's democratic process, saying that there were signs that Russia meddled in the 2019 elections in the UK, also meddled in the referendum. That is, as far as EU membership is concerned. For all the details, we are joined by Mandy Clark, who's joining us from London with all the details. Mandy, over to you. What are the major revelations in this briefing?
Well, the most interesting thing I have to say about that report was absolutely its tone and its unwillingness to unblinkered approach about how much the UK government absolutely failed the British people in protecting them against foreign interference. They refer to as hostile interference. They directly say that they were aware, but they were unwilling to look at it, especially after what happened during the 2016 election in the U.S. It was quite clear that there was great interest in disinformation by the Russian state. The UK knew it and turned a blind eye. It was an unscathing attack on the British Parliament for doing absolutely nothing to protect democracy. They specifically looked, of course, at that Brexit referendum, the amount of disinformation that was put out at the time, the Scottish referendum that was 2 years prior to that, and they said they had 2 years warning that the Russian state had an interest in meddling in British politics. Again, they did nothing. And then, of course, the 2019 election, that was the one that Boris Johnson just won in December. They believe there was also Russian interference. So this was a remarkable attack on the failings of the British government. And it'll be very interesting how they react to this report.
Absolutely. You know, if I heard that briefing correctly, you know, one of the statements was that the attack by Russia is obviously serious. But what's more serious is that there was no effort made by UK authorities to probe and prevent any such attack, which they may have expected after allegations of Russian interference in US elections as well.
Exactly that. It was saying that they did nothing, they knew about it, and that was the bit that the authors of the report found the most astounding, that they were aware of the threat, but just chose not to look into it. Perhaps there was some people in the British public that wanted the interference because they wanted the way the referendum to go ahead. They are alarmed at that lack of action and that ultimately Britain was standing still when a hostile state was working within its borders.
Absolutely. You know, I've got the read here of, you know, their briefing, and it also says that Russia still considers Britain as a hostile state and continues to influence UK's internal politics. Also, does this now put into question marks about Boris Johnson's election as the Prime Minister of the UK? Does it also put a question mark on the Brexit vote?
I think there will be a lot of question marks. As they say in the report, it's impossible to know how disinformation, how those lies that were put out about what Brexit will mean, that was put out by hostile states like Russia, had an effect on the voters. So they said they don't see that they were manipulating the votes in the polling box, but opinions before that. That is an impossible way to know how much that affected the vote. And so it does put into question how people were influenced. And also there has been speculation that this report has been done for quite some time and has been delayed until the summer recess, kicked into the long grass. And many have said it's because there would be allegations that it did have an effect on the 2019 election of Boris Johnson and that he wanted to hide it, the report ultimately. So I'm sure those questions will also come up. the validity of those elections and the referendum.
Absolutely. For our viewers, let me just read out a quick paragraph from this UK government report. It says, the security threat posed by Russia is difficult for the West to manage, as in our view, and that of many others, it appears fundamentally nihilistic. Russia seems to see foreign policy as a zero-sum game. Any actions it can take which damage the West are fundamentally good for Russia. That was Mandy Clark getting us all the details. It's a tell-all press conference by UK spy chiefs. Massive allegations against the UK authorities saying that, no steps were taken to prevent such an interference by Russia in UK's domestic affairs. Mandy, one final question, if you're still with us. These allegations have come at a time when there were also question marks put over the Boris Johnson government that it deliberately did not release this report for some time in order to shield Boris Johnson. What are your views on that?
It's hard to know that there's great speculation on why the delay. There doesn't seem to be any valid reason for it. So that will be those questions that will come up. It does seem like it was kicked into long grass. Normally, the summer recess is a time when people are just less involved in politics. So it seemed like a good time to essentially bury the story. That will be the line of inquiry. Many journalists and also opposition politicians will question why the delay. There doesn't seem there to have been a need. As soon as this report was done, it should have been published.
Absolutely. Mandy Clark getting us all the details. Thank you so much for joining us from London as UK spy chiefs accuse their own government of not taking enough actions to prevent Russia from interfering in UK's domestic affairs, including the 2019 election when Boris Johnson was elected Prime Minister and the Brexit vote as well.